In this chapter, we look at an economic concept known generally as elasticity. And elasticity measures the sensitivity of one variable in response to a change in another. Let's begin by looking at the elasticity of demand. The elasticity of demand is a measure of how responsive the quantity demanded is to a change in price. In other words, when there's a change in price, is there going to be a large change in consumption or small change in consumption? The more responsive consumption or the quantity demanded is to the change in price, the more elastic the demand curve is. And here's an explicit equation that we use to measure the price elasticity of demand. Notice in the numerator is the percentage change in quantity demanded, or the percentage change in consumption. And in the denominator is the percentage change in price. So what we're looking at, again explicitly, is how a change in the denominator is going to affect a change in the numerator. The value of the price elasticity of demand is going to be explicitly negative because according to the law of demand, if price increases by a certain percentage, consumption is going to fall by a certain percentage and vice versa. Let's illustrate this concept of sensitivity or responsiveness by looking at two different demand curves. In this particular graph, we have demand curve I, which is fairly steep, and demand curve E, which is relatively flatter. Notice that given a price of 40, both of these demand curves say that consumption is going to be 100 units. But let's look what happens if the price of both goods increases from $40 to $50. So we have some percentage change in price here. At $50, if we go all the way over to demand curve I and straight down, we see that there was a relatively small percentage decrease in consumption. Given this price increase, consumption only fell from 100 to 95 units. These consumers were not very responsive or very sensitive to this price increase. However, for that same price increase from $40 to $50, if we look at demand curve E, we see that consumption fell from 100 all the way down to 20 units. So these consumers are much more sensitive to the price change. So demand curve I we would label as the less responsive demand curve. Hence we'll see that we tend to call these sorts of demand curves inelastic demand curves. And according to demand curve E, these consumers are more responsive to the price change. We refer to curves like demand curve E as being elastic demand curves. There are different types of elasticities. As we mentioned earlier, if consumers are very responsive to the price change, then we're going to have elastic demand. And what that means is that the numerator for our elasticity of demand equation is going to be larger in absolute value than the denominator. So for instance, a 3% increase in price will lead to, in absolute terms, a decrease in consumption of more than 3%. If we have an inelastic demand curve, the value of the elasticity of demand is going to be less than 1, and that would suggest for that same, let's say, 3% increase in price, consumption is going to fall by less than 3%. Consumers are not very responsive or very sensitive to that price change. And a third type of elasticity is what we refer to as a unit elastic demand curve. In this case, a 3% increase in price would be offset by a 3% decrease in consumption. In each of these examples, I talked about how an increase in price was going to decrease consumption, but we can also measure an elasticity by looking at how a decrease in price would increase consumption. This video served as just a basic introduction to the price elasticity of demand. If you want to know how to calculate a price elasticity, then I encourage you to watch the next video, which I borrowed from Khan Academy. If you're comfortable with how the book presents how to measure the price elasticity of demand with explicit numbers, then feel free to skip over the Khan Academy video, go ahead and return to the determinants of demand video that I've created.